As a part of the outreach ministry of the First Baptist Church in Shreveport, Louisiana, we are pleased to present our pastor, William E. Hull, speaking from the church's pulpit.
I hope all of you are aware that we're beginning a new series this evening, which, except for once or twice when I have to be out of town on a midweek night, will continue for 8 weeks, talking about the heroes of faith, those who since the first century have joined the great cavalcade in Hebrews 11, as those who are pace setters on our pilgrimage, those who are models for our discipleship, those who are especially good company to keep in our spiritual formation. The first and in many ways the most important period in all of church history is the earliest. It is called the patristic period, which means the period of the fathers, and it extends basically from the time of the New Testament to the fall of Rome. This is roughly from about 100 A.D. to 500 A.D. In that period of time, the course was set by which what happened in the New Testament was transformed into the Christian religion that we're familiar with today. And the biggest thing that happened in that 400-year period, something that we tend to neglect because we live in the West, the most significant thing that happened was the division of Christianity into a prominently different Eastern and Western sector. Now we think about Western Christianity because from Catholicism came the Reformation, came on to the Protestantism that we know. But Eastern Christianity, all of the time that Rome was developing, Byzantium or Constantinople was developing. All of the time that Roman Catholicism was developing, Eastern religion was developing until in 1054 A.D. there was a fatal schism that has led today to what we call the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, we don't see many people like that. In Shreveport, the Greek Orthodox Church is a tiny little building, one congregation. But in this world, there are 165 million Christians that belong to this branch of our faith. And the man we're going to look at tonight, Origen, is the quintessence, he is the essence, he is the exemplar, he is almost, as it were, the founder and representative of Eastern Christianity. So let's look at him a few minutes and then suggest some of his contributions. He was born, by the way, the word origin is not our word O-R-I-G-I-N, the beginning of something, the origination. It's O-R-I-G-E-N, and that is an English shortened form of Origenes, O-R-I-G-E-N-E-S, Origenes Admantius. This was a baby born in the year 185 A.D. to Christian parents. That's going to be important for two reasons. One is that his earliest years were characterized by being raised in a godly home and developing a very early, precocious faith. The other reason it's important is that this was a time of persecution, and many of the laws were written against proselyting people of pagan religions. But Origen always had a Christian religion inherited from birth, and he escaped some of the persecution that fell on others, particularly early in his life. His father carefully schooled him in the culture and education of his day. And that's going to become one of the most important things about him, was that as Christianity moved out into the Hellenistic world, Origen was carefully schooled in the philosophy, the rhetoric, the aesthetics, all of the thought of that Greek world. When he was 16 years old, the first great crisis came in his life. A violent persecution erupted under Septimus Severus, 202 A.D. His father was arrested and in peril of his life. Origen was very sure that his father was going to be martyred, and so he was determined to go and stand by him and, if necessary, give his own life for the faith. He was one of 7 boys, the eldest, and his mother thought, what in the world will happen if I lose my husband and my youngest son? So she developed a strategy to keep him from flinging his life into the danger of a possible martyrdom. She used the strategy of modesty. She hid all of his clothes, and he was unwilling to appear in public otherwise. So literally from the strategy of hiding his clothes, she kept Origen from going to the tormentors of his father. Prevented, he wrote his father a letter, the contents of which has been preserved, pleading with him not to renounce the faith out of fear for the sake of his family. And so his father, Leonides, did stand fast. He was beheaded. All of his property was confiscated. And at slightly under 17 years of age, Origen accepted responsibility for the care of his widowed mother and his 6 younger brothers. Early in life, after this great crisis, he became spiritually intense in his dedication. Frankly, some people say he became a fanatic. He decided to live in ascetic poverty, giving any earthly prosperity to his brothers and his mother. He slept on the ground. He wore no shoes on his feet. He had only one coat, one robe. He fasted frequently, part of every week, ate no meat, drank no wine, studied all day long, and most of the night, sleeping very seldom. He was all of his life a prodigious worker. Now, as he became a young adult leader, the ripe teaching in which his father had grounded him, and the further study that he did led to the first way that he made a living, and that was by being a tutor or teacher to others in his native home of Alexandria, which was up in the delta of Egypt near the Mediterranean Sea. Out of this crisis of dedication, there came one event that is somewhat delicate to speak of, but it formed such a remarkable part of his life that I will mention it. Increasingly, as he taught, he attracted young women converts who sought instruction. Origen was always determined that there be not a trace, not a breath of scandal about any of his relationships to women. Therefore, he decided to take literally the instructions of Jesus, which he read in Matthew 19, and to emasculate himself. This is what Matthew 19:12 says. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, that is, celibate individuals who, by some physical circumstance, never marry or exercise any sexual life. There are eunuchs who have been made so by men, in other words, mutilation, torture in war, or something like that. Then there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, most people think that Jesus is there referring to voluntary celibacy or abstinence from any sexual life for the sake of one's vocation as a religious worker, much as we would view a monk today. Origen, however, decided to take that very literally and apply it to himself. The reason that becomes important is that the Jewish law had many prohibitions against mutilating one's own flesh. And later on, when Origen is ordained as a presbyter or priest, the bishops take great exception to one who has been so castrated becoming a priest of the church. I think we can say it illustrates his incredible devotion and his determination to let not a breath of scandal ever circulate about his life. Now let's talk about his career. Due to the persecution in Egypt, the great leader Clement, who was the earliest Christian after the New Testament to lead the church in Egypt, had to abandon his famous catechetical school of Alexandria. Now you need to know that this was the most famous school in early Christianity. And Clement was driven away. When he was driven away, Origen moved into the vacuum that was left and began to teach the students who had no teacher. He was instantly a brilliant success. Students began to flock to him from everywhere. He taught them without any charge, even though he was trying to support a widow and 6 younger children. And he became so famous as a boy prodigy, an 18-year-old, that the bishop, Demetrius, decided to officially assign him the role as headmaster of the famous catechetical school in Alexandria. Now, for us, that would be equivalent to a persecution in which the head of a seminary was driven away and an 18-year-old took his place. Wish we could talk a lot about the youth of Origen. Quite a different thing from today. In any case, soon his reputation as a teacher spread far and wide. People began to come to him even from other countries. This is going to be the seeds of one of his great tensions, and that is ministerial jealousy. During all of this time, he was, of course, just a youth, a young adult. He was a layperson. He was under the bishop, Demetrius. And his first problem came when persecution broke out about A.D. 215. In other words, after he'd been doing this about 10 years. This caused him to flee for his life up into Palestine from Egypt, and he began to settle around Caesarea on the seacoast. The bishops in that area had already heard of his brilliant instruction, and so they asked him to teach publicly. The problem is that enraged his bishop back in Alexandria, Demetrius, because he thought no layperson ought to ever be seen publicly teaching a preacher, a bishop, anything. And so he rebuked him and said, "Come home. You have no business going up into another bishop's area and showing off your learning by pretending to teach those bishops." Well, the plain fact was Origen was much more learned than those bishops, and they did have a lot that they could learn from him. But he's going to get in bad blood with his own bishop, frankly, out of ministerial jealousy for the popularity and talent of a layperson. When he came back, he settled into the most productive period of his career, beginning about 219 A.D., when he got a patron, Ambrosius, who decided he was so brilliant that he ought not to have to worry about earthly affairs, and so he gave enough money to take care of his family. He hired 7 stenographers, shorthand experts, clerks, to sit and take down all of the vast learning of Origen's brain, out of which he became the most prolific writer in the ancient world. We know from the catalog that Origen wrote more than 6,000 books. His commentaries are so long on the Scripture that they have never been edited and translated into English except just in excerpts, in part. Here is a man who combined incredible piety with profound scholarship and yet at the same time busy activity. As his fame grew, he was constantly being asked to take journeys, to go up into Greece, Macedonia, over to Rome, up into Palestine, to explain the faith. Early Christians were starved for understanding, and Origen gave them help. Well, on one of these sojourns, when he had become about 40 years old and was at the height of his power, he was asked to go to Greece, Achaia. That took him up through Caesarea, where he had those friendly bishops that liked to hear him teach. They insisted that he be ordained to the ministry because, after all, he was functioning as the greatest teacher in the whole Eastern Church. Upon his return to Alexandria, Demetrius the bishop learned about it. He was furious because obviously he had not had the honor of ordaining this great Origen himself as teacher. Frankly, Demetrius could not understand the teachings of Origen. They were over his head. He was a busy, politically oriented bishop. He didn't have time for study, and he was jealous of his fabulous reputation. So when you add jealousy to ignorance to anger, you get a potent combination in any preacher, particularly if he's a bishop. And so he decided that he would banish Origen, and he convened a synod, in other words, an official church council there in Alexandria, and got them to vote that he would never again be allowed to teach in Alexandria. Now you talk about spite. Here is the most brilliant man alive in the whole Christian world, and one pouting bishop is not willing for him to teach. But the synod was not willing to defrock him from ordination, which is what Demetrius wanted. So he called a second synod, limited it only to bishops, and obviously was able to convince them that Origen was some sort of threat to them. Therefore, they did excommunicate him. So you need to know, and this is going to be an interesting story, any Christian who gets well ahead of his own church, as someone has said, the church is the only army that shoots its own wounded. Well, Origen is excommunicated. He is banished from Alexandria. Most of the churches in Egypt and beyond refused to accept the verdict of the synod. And they simply welcomed him to teach and preach in their churches whenever he would. Well, when this happened, he moved to Palestine, and that's why we call him Origen of Caesarea, because he spent the next 20 years, from his early 40s to his early 60s, teaching around Caesarea up on the seacoast in the central part of Palestine. During this time, persecution was growing. I don't know whether you know anything about the history of the Roman Empire, but the Emperor Decian, D-E-C-I-E-N, probably sponsored the fiercest persecution of all, worse even than Nero or Domitian, the ones you've heard about in the New Testament time. When this happened, about A.D. 250, Origen was thrown into jail. He was chained in a deep dungeon with heavy chains. He was tortured. He was threatened with fire. He was subject to humiliation and indignity. He never recanted his faith, and they were not willing to kill him. So finally they released him, but his health was broken, and by 254, at the age of 69, he died nearby in Caesarea in the town of Tyre, T-Y-R-E, that we know from Tyre and Sidon. As a great church historian has put it, no man of purer spirit or nobler aims ornaments the history of the ancient church. Now let's take 5 minutes to talk about the accomplishments of this incredible pioneer of Eastern Christianity. The overarching thing to remember is Origen inherited a religion of Palestine, of Judaism, of the first century, and he gave his whole life to making it a Christianity not of the first century but of the second, not of Palestine but of the Greek world, not of Judaism but of Hellenism. He gave it the Greek language, not the Hebrew language. He translated Christianity and made it relevant for his day. Now let me show you what he did to do that. First of all, Origen was our first great biblical historian. He realized that Christianity would have to rest on firm sources. Therefore, in everything that he taught, he always went back to the original primary sources. He learned the Hebrew language just so he could read his Jewish sources in the original Hebrew. One of the things he wrote was a hexapla. Now that just means 7 things. And the 7 things were 7 columns of the Old Testament. 3 of them were Hebrew traditions. He even discovered lost Hebrew manuscripts. And he found 3 great traditions. In other words, these are rabbinic schools where he, it just shows how electric this is. Discovered 3 of the great schools where they kept the Hebrew text. Then he discovered 4 great traditions in the Greek translations called the Septuagint of the Old Testament. Now what he was brave enough to do was line up all 7 of those side by side, which would expose any differences between them. And in a very scholarly way, he went through every little point by point by point and explained what the correct text should be. He had nothing to hide. He was not simply taking one tradition or another. What he was saying was, let's get all of the evidence. Let's look at it. Let's decide what is the original best manuscript, and let's base everything upon it. Second, he was the first great biblical expositor. Up to this time, the Bible had not been completed, including the New Testament, long enough for anyone to treat it as a whole. Origen was the first person to do what you see every Sunday, to teach people how to take a text, a passage, and preach a sermon on it. Nobody had ever done that before. He was the first person to write what we would call a biblical commentary. That is, to do a continuous narrative or exposition unfolding the meaning of the text. To start, for example, at John 1:1 and go to verse 2, 3, all the way through the book. No one had ever done this before. He was always looking for the deeper theological meanings, and so he became the first biblical theologian of the early church. But he went even farther. Not only historian and commentator, expositor, he wrote a book which in Greek was called Periarchon. Now, peri simply means about something, and archon means first things, beginnings. In Latin, it's called De Principiis, which means concerning the first principles. What this book was an effort to take the Christian faith and go back to first principles, deciding exactly what it meant. This was the first synthesis of Christian knowledge with secular knowledge. It was an effort to take the way Greeks think. He was a Greek, and to state the Christian faith in that form, not the way Jews thought 100 years earlier, but the way Greeks thought then. He also became the first great apologete. There was a man named Celsus. He wrote a book called Against Celsus. Celsus was the most brilliant critic of Christianity. He was a Platonist philosopher. He raised the deepest objections to the Christian faith. Origen said, I will sit down point by point and answer every one of them. The result of this is Christianity gained an intellectual understanding in the Greek world that it had never had before. As one church historian says, with Origen, Christianity ceased to be an addition or an appendage to the classical world. It became intellectually a universe of its own. In other words, Origen didn't say you've got to believe it. That's an affair of the heart. But he said you've got to respect it. And that's all the difference you see in the world. Now, time's up. I'm going to take 1 minute of somebody else's time. What is the issue raised by the life of Origen? Origen's life raises one great issue, because basically the Eastern mind was a universal mind, was a synthesizing, reconciling, mediating mind. Origen saw God working in everything. God was working in all of the culture and civilization of his Greek world. God was working in all of his Christian faith. Therefore, he tried to put them together. He tried to unite them. Even in the face of persecution from his world, he pursued a grand synthesis that would combine all knowledge, all learning, all wisdom into one. Now, after Origen's time, the church took a dim view of this. They decided that the classical world was not right, that this was knowledge to be rejected. They allowed the universities to decline and to close. They allowed Origen to fall into disrepute. They said we are to win the world by our faith, rejecting the wisdom of men rather than synthesizing the wisdom of men. In other words, to state it in a phrase, Origen saw Christianity as for the world, its highest and greatest destiny. His successor saw Christianity against the world, conquering it and defeating it and putting it under subjection. Now, frankly, the issue of Origen is with us today. Are we willing, like he was, to search out our historical beginnings and criticize them until they're cleansed of any objection, until they will stand in the eyes of any objective critic? Are we willing to go back to first principles and formulate the Christian faith for 20th century America? Are we willing to take the whole world of ideas and thought and answer our sharpest critics with reason and evidence, not with denunciation and demand? To keep company with Origen is to affirm that all things are of God and that God will finally reconcile all things unto Himself.
This concludes Dr. Hall's sermon. We pray that its message has brought new insight to your life. If there is any way that Dr. Hall or our staff may be of Christian service to you, please do not hesitate to call or write us. We will give your inquiry a prompt, courteous, and confidential reply. Our address is First Baptist Church, 543 Ockley Drive, Shreveport, Louisiana, 71106. The telephone number is area code 318-865-8414.